Okay, so this is the final session and the final movement, and it's going to be allegro vivacissimo, because it's going to be 6 people with 10 minutes each, a real sort of merry-go-round. So let's start it off with Toby Burrows, who's a senior honorary research fellow in the School of Humanities at the University of Western Australia, and also a senior researcher at the Oxford E-Research Centre in Oxford. I'm going to do very brief introductions because to give more time to each of the people presenting. And in this we're going to be going back to talking about Phillipps. And Toby, if you can,
yep.
if you want to find your... I'll leave. I think it's probably best if we go right through the 6 presentations and leave questions to the end, and also sort of conclusions as well.
Thank you, Stephen. Good afternoon, everyone. Yes, I'll try not to speak molto vivace, but get through it in 10 minutes. Talking about Phillipps in 10 minutes is a difficult task. This is work from a European Union-funded project, which was a Marie Curie International Fellowship at King's College London. So that was the word from my sponsors. That was from 2014, 2016. And in this project, I used the collection of Sir Thomas Phillipps to test and evaluate approaches for combining and visualising provenance evidence. So as you heard this morning, the Phillipps collection is important for its sheer size. There are some of the estimates of its size, and also for its variety. Not only did he have manuscripts from all over Europe, some from Persia, India, lots of documents, documentary material, right up to the 19th century. But it wasn't simply manuscripts. There were many, many printed books and artworks as well, and photographs. And also important for its dispersal and the history of its dispersal after Phillipps' death in 1872, and the way that material from the collection has now spread out into libraries across the world. So inevitably there's a vast amount of documentation relating to the Phillipps collection, and particularly the subsequent histories of the manuscripts. And they range from, not a complete list, an exhaustive list, but a fairly full list, ranging from databases at the top, both specialised and more general, through printed catalogues, to handwritten indexes and annotated catalogues. And I didn't even put on there the documentary evidence, correspondence, and so on as well. So some of this material is fairly difficult to deal with from the perspective of getting it into a digital environment. This is one of the inventories made up after Phillipps' death for probate purposes, and later used by his grandson Fenwick to manage the collection. That only covers about the next 2,500 manuscripts after the end of his printed catalogue. And then there's Tim Munby's annotations to a copy of the printed Phillipps catalogue. That's the copy now in the Bodleian, added to by Bodleian staff. I keep running into librarians who say, oh, I entered material into Phillipps annotations of that kind. And there's a card index that's similar at the British Library, of course. And so this kind of evidence you have to key in manually if you want to get it into some kind of digital environment, obviously enough. But not all digital evidence, or currently already digital evidence, can be easily analysed. So that's a fairly typical manuscript record from a library catalogue. I'm not singling out the State Library of Victoria particularly, but that's one of the Phillipps manuscripts now in Australia, based on the marked record format. And as in printed catalogues, provenance presented as a narrative note. And the difficulty from a computational point of view is that from looking at that, the computer can't readily tell who are the people involved and which are the dates and which are the places and so on, at least not without further processing. So for my project, I built a digital environment where the different forms of evidence could be combined using software called NodeGoat, produced by a Dutch company, used for a variety of European projects. And you can enter data into that either just by keying it in by web forms that you design yourself, or you can load data in bulk from spreadsheets. So for that, I also needed some kind of common data model, as the computer science people would call it. And after looking at various prototypes and examples, that's still a work in progress very much. It's got 5 basic types of things, entities. But as you'll see with the red highlighting, it's very much focused on events in the ownership history of manuscripts. So that might be clearer if I show you a quick example. That's one of the treasures of the Morgan Library in New York now, the Crusader Bible. It was also one of the treasures of the Phillipps collection. And it has a particularly rich and interesting history. And the somewhat partial record that I've produced in my NodeGoat database looks like that. Apart from a brief description at the top, it's then got a series of events in the history of the manuscript from its production through various evidences for its ownership at particular times, and then sales at various points as well. So as you can see, that has gone from Paris to Naples to Krakow to Isfahan to Cairo and then to England and finally to New York. And what NodeGoat can do is show that on a map, which is a good way of at least summarising that evidence and digesting it in one screen, although there is a certain reductionist element to that, inevitably. You can also use the same approach for groups of manuscripts. So this is 23 of the Phillipps manuscripts that were later owned by Alfred Chester Beatty, showing their history. And the other interesting thing about this is that there's a time slider at the bottom, so you can then see that map for particular time periods. So that's the same 23 manuscripts from their origins up until 1924, before the first of Chester Beatty's sales. And then that's what happened to them from 1929 onwards. And the other thing NodeGoat can do is take the people, the places, the manuscripts, and the sources, the documentary sources, and turn them into what's called a network graph, a graph of relationships between all those different entities. And that's the same Beatty group. You can also use the time slider to see that at various different time periods. That's the group up to 1924. And then subsequent to that. And then on a larger scale, the network graph starts producing interesting pictures, if nothing else. That's about nearly 1,500 of the Phillipps manuscripts, heavily skewed towards the Bodleian Library, which is that large centripetal element down at the bottom there. So this is not a representative sample at all. But I use this in a study of Phillipps manuscripts now in North America, of which there are over 2,300 at least. And if you look at the same group of 1,500 on a map, you can certainly see the movement across the Atlantic pretty easily. I also included, purely for personal interest, some Australian connections on that map, as you can see, including that painting, which is famous in Australia as the earliest European representation of an Aboriginal corroboree, we think, from 1832 in Tasmania. That was owned by Phillipps. It was in his house in Cheltenham. Now in Australia again, the Art Gallery of South Australia. But it does show how that kind of approach that I'm using for provenance can be used for other types of cultural objects. It's not just manuscripts, it's more generic than that. So that's the Phillipps project, and I'll just finish with a little advertisement for our next project, our current project, which is called Mapping Manuscript Migrations, funded by the Digging into Data program. We have 4 partners from Oxford, Helsinki, Philadelphia and Paris. And what we're doing is combining provenance evidence from different types of database. Those are the 4 initial sources that we're using, chosen because the partner institutions maintain them. So again, not entirely typical. And even though they're all digital, and that's a requirement of the grant program, they have very different scope, different structures and so on. So there's about 350,000 records in those 4 databases in all. And what we're currently doing is pulling them together, or at least putting together a data model to start with, based partly on the different sources and partly on research questions identified by researchers. And what we're going to do in the new year is start trying to build a common digital environment for managing, interlinking that data and then visualizing it and analysing it. So there are the contact details. You can follow us on Twitter and on the web and various other things like that. Thank you very much.